What if the fact that you feel lost isn't a mistake, but the exact point where Jesus begins to speak? Pause for a moment and think about that honestly. How many times have you asked yourself why, even when you're doing everything right? There's still this strange inner confusion. You work, you handle responsibilities, you try to be a good person, maybe you even keep a life of faith, and still something doesn't click. It's like walking hard, but not knowing if you're headed the right way. A lot of people live like that right now. On the outside, everything looks put together. On the inside, there's a quiet exhaustion, a doubt that won't settle. A question that keeps coming back, usually late at night, when the noise of the day finally fades. What am I doing with my life? Or worse, is God actually hearing me? Maybe you pray. Maybe you've prayed a lot. And still, you don't get the clear answer you expected. No audible voice, no obvious sign, no strong certainty in your chest. That creates frustration, and over time, it creates guilt, because there's this idea that if your faith were strong enough, you wouldn't feel confused. But what if that idea is wrong? There's a specific kind of anguish that shows up in people who believe but don't understand what's happening. It's not a lack of faith. It's not rebellion. It's a real internal conflict. You trust Jesus Christ, but you feel disoriented. You love God, but you don't know what step to take. And you start thinking maybe the problem is you. Here's a question that disarms the mind because it breaks old expectations. What if Jesus isn't silent? What if he's answering in a different way than you were taught to expect? Most of us grow up thinking a divine answer should feel like total clarity, instant certainty, a powerful feeling that wipes out doubt. When that doesn't happen, we quickly assume there was no answer at all. But Jesus, throughout history, rarely responded like that. He dealt with people who were confused, exhausted, afraid, and full of questions. People who were lost inside even while walking right beside him, and he didn't push them away. If anything, it was in that exact place of confusion that some of the deepest conversations happened. Maybe the discomfort you feel today isn't a sign of spiritual failure. Maybe it's an invitation, a transition, a moment where shallow answers just don't work anymore. The central issue isn't only whether Jesus responds. The real issue is how we're looking for the response. Are we paying attention to the format? Are we ignoring something obvious because we're waiting for something extraordinary? Before we go further, sit with this question for a second. What if the problem was never the absence of an answer, but the way you learn to look for it? When someone says, "I feel lost," they usually assume the problem is outside of them. A career direction, a relationship that's messy, a big decision that won't come together. But most of the time, the real disconnect isn't in circumstances, it's inside. It's possible to have a life that looks organized and still feel an emptiness you can't explain. You wake up, you get things done, you talk to people, you make choices, everything functions, but nothing feels like it has real weight. Meaning is missing. Connection is missing. That feeling of being aligned with something bigger is missing. That's the most common kind of being lost today. Not losing an external path, but losing an internal center. Externally, being lost is not knowing where to go. Internally, it's not knowing why to go. And that difference changes everything. Because when the problem is external, advice can fix it. When the problem is internal, no quick answer satisfies. A lot of people confuse faith with the absence of conflict. They believe that if you trust God, you shouldn't feel confused. But that's not what we see in real human experience, and it's not what we see even in Scripture. Faith doesn't erase the tension between reason, emotion, and spirit. It exposes it. Reason wants logic, predictability, and control. Emotion wants safety, relief, and reassurance. Spiritual life points towards something that doesn't always fit neatly into either one. When those three collide, the feeling of being lost shows up. You overthink, you feel too much, and you pray without even knowing exactly what to ask for. On top of that, there's the weight of decisions. Every choice feels like it carries huge risk. The fear of making the wrong move freezes you. The fear of regret confuses you, and without realizing it, you start comparing yourself to others, people who seem to know exactly what they want, people who look like they have all the answers. That only deepens the sense that something is wrong with you. Then comes the loss of meaning, not constant sadness, not full-on despair, something quieter, a feeling like life is happening, but you're not really in it, like you're watching from the outside. That state isn't new. It repeats throughout human history, even among people who are deeply connected to Jesus Christ. The disciples walked with him for years. They heard his teaching, saw extraordinary things, and still felt lost more than once. They didn't fully understand what was happening. They had expectations that didn't get met. They were confused by what Jesus did. Peter is a clear example, bold, impulsive, full of confidence. In one moment, he swears total loyalty. Not long after, he falls apart emotionally and spiritually, not because he had no faith, but because he had too much confidence in himself. He gets lost when he realizes he doesn't know himself as well as he thought. Thomas represents another kind of lostness. He needs to understand in order to trust. When he doesn't understand, he freezes. He doesn't reject Jesus. He demands proof. His doubt isn't disrespect. It's an unresolved internal conflict, and Jesus doesn't condemn him for it, but he also doesn't let him stay stuck. These examples reveal something important. Feeling lost doesn't mean you're far from God. Many times, it means you're in the middle of a growth process, a place where old certainties don't work anymore, but new ones haven't formed yet. Jesus understands that place. He doesn't treat human confusion with contempt. He steps into it, but he also doesn't let people settle into it. There's comfort and there's confrontation, not against doubt itself, but against the paralysis doubt can create. The problem starts when you interpret feeling lost as proof you've been abandoned. From there, everything gets heavier. Prayer turns mechanical. Reading scripture feels flat. Decisions become even harder. But what if that feeling is actually an internal alarm, an invitation to reassess, a call to wake up from autopilot, to stop living only as a reaction to external pressure and start listening to something deeper? The problem isn't that you feel lost. The risk is trying to fix it the wrong way, by chasing answers in the wrong way, by using methods that no longer fit the season of life you're in. There's a mistake almost every person of faith makes when they get to this place. A hidden expectation that creates constant frustration, and until that expectation is exposed, the feeling of being lost only grows. That's exactly what we need to talk about next. When someone feels lost and looks for an answer from Jesus, there's almost always a silent expectation underneath it all that the answer will arrive as total clarity, instant relief, like every doubt will be removed in one moment. That's the most common mistake, and it's also the most paralyzing. There's a widespread belief that a real answer from Jesus should erase discomfort, that when he speaks, confusion ends, that faith works like a switch that turns off uncertainty. When that doesn't happen, people assume they didn't hear anything, or worse, that they weren't worthy of hearing. So they start chasing stronger and stronger signs, a powerful emotion during prayer, a dramatic spiritual moment, a dream that feels crystal clear, the perfect external confirmation, something that guarantees absolute certainty before they move. But that kind of search doesn't produce faith. It produces emotional dependence. You start measuring Jesus' presence by how intense your feelings are. When you feel something strong, you assume you're on the right track. When you don't, you freeze, you wait, and while you wait, Life goes on hold. That frustration grows because Jesus doesn't usually respond by removing all doubt. He doesn't build relationship through control. He builds it through trust. Here's a difference most people miss. An answer, the way we usually want it, closes the subject. It ends the tension. It gives you a sense of control. Direction is different. Direction requires movement, decision, risk. Human nature wants to understand before acting. It wants guarantees before committing. It wants safety before trusting. That feels logical. But faith works differently. Jesus Christ never presented life as a path fully explained before the first step. He never called people by saying, "Understand everything and then come." He said, "Follow me." That invitation is uncomfortable. Following means moving without seeing the whole route, leaving what's familiar, letting go of control. Many people get frustrated because they expect Jesus to explain every detail before asking for trust. But he often does the opposite. He asks for trust so understanding can form along the way. That's not manipulation, it's formation. When someone demands total understanding before obedience, what they're really saying is, "I'll trust if I can keep control." And control is exactly what needs to be confronted in a person who feels lost. Notice the pattern. Jesus' answers often show up after movement, not before. After a decision, after a step taken while still afraid. Not because he enjoys testing people, but because certain kinds of understanding only appear through experience. As long as you insist on staying still until you feel absolute certainty, you may not realize that absolute certainty was never promised. What was promised was presence, companionship on the road, enough direction for the next step, not the entire journey. This mistake creates a constant feeling of abandonment. You start believing Jesus isn't answering, when in reality, you're ignoring the kind of answer he usually gives. Jesus doesn't respond like a manual. He responds like a mentor. A mentor doesn't hand you every solution. They point you to the next move that strengthens you. And there's something else most people miss. There's a clear pattern in how Jesus responds to people who feel lost. It's simple, repeated, human, but it often gets overlooked because it doesn't satisfy our craving for instant control. That's the pattern we need to see next, because once you see it, a lot starts to make sense. When you look closely at how Jesus Christ relates to people who are confused, exhausted, or disoriented, a pattern becomes clear. He doesn't hand out detailed maps. He offers principles. He doesn't explain every why. He stays present. He doesn't demand giant leaps. He guides small steps. Jesus responds in a way that strengthens you, not in a way that makes you dependent. Many people want specific instructions for every detail of life, but Jesus rarely operates at that level of control. Instead, he works on character, conscience, and inner direction. Because when those are aligned, external decisions begin to make more sense. You see this in the Gospels in a very practical way. When people brought him complicated questions, he often answered with something direct, almost disarmingly simple. Love, forgive, serve, trust. Not long explanations, principles that, when lived out, start to reorganize a life from the inside out. Another key piece is that Jesus responds with presence, not always with words. He walks with people, he watches, he stays close to the process. To someone who feels lost, that can seem like not enough, but in real life, that presence is what holds you steady. Presence creates inner stability. Stability makes movement possible. Movement creates clarity. Jesus also responds through small, concrete next steps. Something simple, something you already know you need to do but have been avoiding. A hard conversation, an apology, a boundary that has to be set, a decision you keep delaying. He's not asking you to fix everything at once. He's pointing to the next possible step. In modern life, this shows up in everyday choices. Instead of waiting for a dramatic spiritual moment, Jesus often leads through daily obedience. Telling the truth when lying would be easier, staying consistent when nobody's watching, choosing simplicity in a culture that pressures you to compete. It doesn't sound dramatic, but it's transformational. Jesus doesn't treat human confusion as a problem to quickly erase. He treats it like fertile ground for growth. The answer doesn't arrive as a long explanation, but as an invitation to practice. That's why people often say, "I didn't hear anything," when in reality they've already heard enough to take action. The discomfort remains not because there's no answer, but because there's no movement. There's a quiet question Jesus tends to surface in people who feel lost. What do you already know you need to do, but you keep putting off? That question isn't meant to scare you. It calls you into responsibility and at the same time into freedom, because you realize you're not abandoned. You're being invited to participate in the process. Clarity often begins when you stop waiting for something extraordinary and start obeying in the ordinary. That's where direction becomes visible. Before we move on, take a moment and reflect honestly. Is there something simple, clear, and possible that you already recognize, but you've been avoiding because of fear or insecurity? Even after hearing all of this, some people will still say sincerely, "I've tried, I've taken steps, and I still don't feel like the answer is clear." That's a delicate place, because this is where the temptation to quit shows up, or the temptation to force clarity that hasn't matured yet. Silence can be part of the process, not as absence, but as space. Space where anxiety gets confronted, where impatience is exposed, where faith stops being a concept and becomes daily practice. When the answer still isn't clear, the most common mistake is to freeze everything, to wait for a definitive sign before continuing with life. But Jesus never taught faith as a pause button. He taught steadiness. This is the season where simple obedience matters most. Not dramatic moves, not big emotional moments, just what's within reach today. Doing the good you can do, acting with integrity, caring for what's been entrusted to you right now. Small daily choices begin to organize the inside, and when the inside becomes more ordered, direction becomes easier to recognize. Jesus Christ doesn't present himself only as someone who hands you ready-made answers. He presents himself as a guide in the process, walking with you even when the landscape still looks unclear. There's something almost no one notices. When everything feels quiet, it doesn't always mean nothing is happening. It can mean something is being examined, something internal, invisible. There's a kind of test that doesn't show up in words or obvious signs, a test that happens before full clarity arrives. And understanding this changes the way you deal with silence. That's the test we need to talk about now. There's a point in the spiritual journey where you face something uncomfortable. The answer you want doesn't come before obedience. It often comes after. And that gap between not fully understanding and still being called to keep walking is what you could call an invisible test. That test doesn't measure knowledge. It doesn't measure emotion. It measures trust. Most people associate faith with feeling something strong, peace, excitement, certainty, but faith shows up differently in real life. It shows up when you keep doing what's right even without total reassurance, when you take the next step while still afraid, when you choose integrity even without recognition. Jesus Christ never portrayed faith as a constant emotional high. He portrayed it as a posture, a practice, a repeated choice. The invisible test confronts the desire for control. It asks, without words, whether you trust only when you understand, or whether you can trust even when you can't see the full picture. And it isn't theoretical. It plays out in everyday moments. It shows up when you tell the truth even if it might cost you, when you hold to a value without immediate payoff, when you keep praying even when you don't feel anything shifting. Some answers come only after action because certain truths can't be explained. They have to be lived. Clarity doesn't come before the path. It rises inside the path. That's why so many people get stuck. Not because they don't have faith, but because they're waiting for fear to disappear before they move. Fear rarely disappears first. It shrinks afterward. Taking the next possible step doesn't mean making huge impulsive decisions. It means asking honestly, what is the simplest, most right next move I can make today? And then doing it with consistency. When you accept this process, something begins to change inside you. Anxiety starts losing its grip. Thoughts become less chaotic. The feeling of being lost starts giving way to a quiet sense of direction, not a rush of emotion, a steadiness, a release. That release comes from realizing you're not stuck. You're moving, even if slowly, even if imperfectly. Jesus doesn't demand perfection in the journey. He sustains the ones who keep walking. When you understand that trusting before fully understanding isn't irresponsibility, but spiritual maturity, your relationship with God deepens. Faith stops being a demand for answers and becomes a partnership on the road. And this sets you up for something important, because there's a truth that needs to be said clearly. If you feel lost, that doesn't mean Jesus has pulled away. In many cases, it means the opposite. That's how we'll close. If you've made it this far while carrying that sense of being lost, hear this slowly and clearly. Feeling lost is not proof you've been abandoned. It's not evidence that Jesus has turned away from you. Many times, it's exactly the opposite. There are seasons in life when old certainties stop working. Things that once felt clear lose their meaning. That's frightening, but it also reveals something important. It can be a sign that you're being invited to grow, to wake up from autopilot, to deepen your relationship with what you say you believe. Jesus Christ never ignored people who were confused. He never dismissed those who were tired on the inside. He drew near. He spoke to them. He walked with them, not to rush the process, but to sustain them through it. When you feel lost, the temptation is to assume you failed, that you didn't do enough, that you messed up too badly. But often, this feeling shows up because you're being called to trust in a new way, less based on control, more based on presence. Maybe Jesus isn't trying to hand you every answer right now. Maybe he's teaching you how to walk with questions. And that isn't weakness, it's depth. Ask yourself honestly, what is this season trying to teach me? Where am I trying to control too much? What do I need to release? What small step do I already know I need to take, even without guarantees? Those questions don't require instant answers. They require sincerity, and sincerity creates space for clarity. If this message connected with you, share in the comments what stood out the most. Sometimes putting it into words is already a meaningful step. And if you know someone who feels lost right now, sending this video could be a simple but powerful act of care. Subscribe to the channel so you can keep walking through reflections like this. Content made for people seeking clarity, direction, and a more grounded faith that actually connects to real life. And stay close. In the next video, we'll go even deeper. Because when you understand how Jesus leads, even in the silence, that feeling of being lost begins to give way to something far more solid.